afternoon, everyone. Thanks for the introduction, Stuart. So today I'll talk a bit about the background to this LFI guidance document, why it was considered needed, and give a flavour of some of the contents and the themes within the document. This picture shows the immediate aftermath of the Challenger disaster, which took place in 1986. As you know, following on from that, there was a major investigation into the causes. And following on from that investigation, there were a number of changes, both in the hardware of the space shuttle, in the processes adopted for getting it ready for launch, etc., and in the wider NASA organisation and the subcontractors. But again, as we know, in 2003, 17 years later, the Columbia space shuttle was integrated, and again, there was another major investigation into that. But one of the broad findings from that second disaster was that the lessons from the first had been forgotten, memory had been lost of some of the key learnings. Equally relevant to learning from incidents is the fact that both of those disasters that was preceded by lesser severity events. In the case of Challenger, there were several events involving O-ring erosion. In the case of Columbia, on 4 previous flights, the ramp installation had come away and either nearly impacted or impacted the shuttle as it launched. So when we look at these types of disasters, and obviously we can look at also ones from our own industries, and set that alongside the academic research, there's a conclusion that in fact learning from incidents can be very difficult. So that led the Energy Institute and its stakeholders to think that actually the kind of constraints and the blockages that many organisations have with LFI need to be better understood and documented in a way that we could digest it. And that indeed the enablers to overcoming these constraints and blockages need to be identified and again shared in a sort of good practice guide. So that was some of the thinking behind the documents. And as Stuart mentioned, that led to the Energy Institute and the Tripod Foundation getting together and specifying these objectives for the guidance document, that it should act as an initial go-to resource for LFI, but pointing to other more detailed resources as necessary. As you know, there is an awful lot of stuff out there around incident investigation, reporting, etc. So we didn't want to just duplicate that. To inform good practice for all the key phases of the LFI life cycle, and with a particular focus not just on the accident incident investigation part, but on broader learning, and we'll talk a bit about what broader learning entails. So before we go any further, it's probably worth asking the question, what is learning from incidents? It feels like we hear the phrase the need to learn lessons a lot. When you turn on TV or radio, you're often hearing about it in the context of sporting events or politics or business. It's almost become a cliche. But when you actually talk to people in the context of learning from industrial events, you do find that people have different interpretations of it. So here's 4 examples. Number 1. Does it mean that the team of investigators has understood how and why an incident occurred? Is that what LFI is about? Or does it mean that several people in an organisation now know how to prevent it happening again? Is that closer to the core of what LFI is? Does it mean that an organisation has implemented a set of changes which will prevent this event happening again? Is that a good definition of LFI? Oops, sorry. Or, sorry, this is a... Or does it mean that an organisation has implemented a set of changes which will prevent this event, and indeed similar events happening again, and even learnt about its processes for LFI? When when you set those definitions alongside each other, it becomes clear that exactly what you mean by it is going to affect how you act after an incident. If you believe it's number one, you'll act in a different way from if you think a fuller definition of LFI is encapsulated by number 4. What we found when we ran the various workshops, which provided the sort of core material for the guidance document, was the fact that people came back to the need for change. It's very hard to argue you've actually learned from an incident or a set of incidents if you're still doing roughly the same stuff that you were doing before. So that aspect of change, which is talked about in definition number 3 and 4, seems closer to what people really understand is needed for LFI. In terms of why it's needed, the guide also talks a bit about the potential benefits for LFI on the risk profile of an organisation. If we start with the sort of typical accident pyramid with hopefully a few major accidents at the top, but then underneath that there's going to be a larger number of less severe accidents and incidents, and underneath that a much larger set of accident precursors in terms of unsafe acts and conditions. If an organisation or industry indeed is learning mainly from major accidents, then perhaps the risk profile is going to look as shown on the right-hand side. So following a major accident, there's going to be momentum and resources poured into reducing risk, and one could expect perhaps a rapid reduction in the risk levels. But once that momentum's gone and enthusiasm has sort of dissipated a bit for doing something about it, there's likely to be a flattening off and maybe even a kind of roller coaster ride in the risk profile, where you're getting competing pressures from costs, from production, alongside perhaps top-down driven safety initiatives, which aren't really being fed by real-life material. By contrast, if we can make use of the whole range of events that an organisation and indeed an industry is experiencing, then, as well as accidents, there's the potential to learn from incidents, near misses. And obviously those are going to be more frequent and provide opportunities for learning, continuous learning, that should drive down levels of risk to a level that we feel is much more sustainable and much reduced losses. So to achieve that, hopefully more sustainable long-term picture, we identified 5 broad phases to the LFI process. Number 1, reporting, followed by investigation, followed by recommendations and actions coming out of that. And then the 4th one, which we characterised as broader learning. So from this we meant that the learning isn't being confined to the particular people who were involved in the event or their department, but it's spread more widely in the organisation. It's being used to learn not just from that event, but perhaps from similar or even dissimilar events. And finally, that learning is being spread outside the organisation to the industry more widely, and indeed that organisation is sucking back in information from the wider industry. So if those 4 building blocks are working well, that should lead to, as we mentioned, sort of long-term sustainable change. But we can't assume that that is going to happen, so there needs to be an evaluation stage following that as well. So there needs to be an evaluation about have those actions and recommendations actually led to the right sort of changes that reduce risk. If not, there needs to be a feedback to come up with modified actions. On top of that, the evaluation block also needs to consider, is the LFI process itself working well? Is reporting working well? Are the investigations what we want, etc.? So that also needs to feed back into the previous 4 steps. So if all that's going well, then we should get to a situation where we're having the sort of changes that are leading to lower risk. As a number of you may know, there's been quite a lot of research into how organisations learn, and some recent research by TNO looked at the sort of loss of learning potential that occurs in organisations. So they did some survey-based research, including a large number of organisations, including those who run major hazard operations. And the finding there was actually there's a sort of loss of learning potential at each of these key stages. It's not confined to broader learning, for example, but even in areas where there is already good practice out there, and we perhaps think our systems are more mature, such as investigation, even here, the surveys were revealing loss of learning potential. So partly as a result of that type of academic research, the guidance document that Stuart introduced does try and cover all these main stages without focusing on any particular one. Another theme that's widely represented in the guidance document is the concept of the user experience of LFI. We know from sort of marketing campaigns, etc., that people, if they have a positive experience of using a product or a service, they're more likely to be enthusiastic about it and use it a second time. So in terms of what that means in terms of good and bad LFI, the sorts of things that we touch on in the guidance document, at the reporting stage, as we know, it can take quite a lot of courage and trust to actually report certain things, particularly if they're not obvious to the organisation more widely, and they don't necessarily reflect that well on the reporter. So actually having some thanks, some positive feedback coming from a supervisor or a manager is an important part of encouraging reporting. We would hope that that's then going to be followed by fair interviews with emphasis on learning, not blaming individuals. We would also hope that the person who's taken the trouble to report the event is going to be informed of how that information is being used, how the investigation is progressing. And we know that also having personnel involved in identifying potential risk-reducing measures, recommendations, is a very valuable part of the process, one that the UK HSE is very keen on. Once the investigation is complete, giving personnel time and opportunities to actually consider the investigation outputs and to have time and techniques to reflect on that is a very good way to spread that learning more widely, and I think we hear about that in subsequent presentations. And if all these things are stitched together, hopefully that adds up to a positive experience that's going to lead to more reporting and a virtuous circle within our LFI processes. By contrast, we know that sometimes the reaction of supervisors, etc., isn't to give thanks, but it's going to be a bit stronger and potentially less constructive for understandable reasons sometimes. But in terms of the big picture of LFI, that can be a very negative thing. If the reporting operator is marched away to an office for an aggressive interview, that's going to add to the feeling that this is a negative experience. And if the investigation focuses on who did what wrong, with very little consideration of underlying factors that may be within more systematic representing organisational problems, that adds up to a string of negatives that's likely to put people off real learning. At the end of all that, if the lessons learned exercise really centres on what individuals' errors were made and how important it is to follow existing procedures, there's very little new likely to come out from all of that. And we shouldn't be surprised if reporting dries up and LFI withers. So what the guidance sets out to do is within each chapter give some process diagrams like this, a description of key steps, based on the workshops, a list of blockers to LFI, and things that people are doing in terms of good practice to try and help enable better LFI. So this is an example from the beginning of the reporting chapter. It covers the reporting itself through formal reports and informal mechanisms such as toolbox talks, feedback at safety meetings, over coffee, etc. Safety concerns could be raised in any of those sorts of forums. If the reporting is working well in an organisation, hopefully there's a case that you've got so much material, you actually need to do some sorting of that material. It won't necessarily be possible to do deep dive investigations on every single reported event. So having a process for recording, classifying and prioritising those events is going to be very important, and that's going to affect the investigation level and possibly the various methods and techniques you use for the investigation. If the latter stages are working well, then you should be getting some positive feedback from downstream. If people can see that information is being used well, that will further encourage reporting. So each chapter of the guidance addresses one of these main phases, presents some material around these various process diagrams. And to bring it alive a bit, there's quite a few examples in the guidance and case studies, not all of which are from the energy industries. We had some very valuable input from aviation, from rail. So one of the reporting case studies comes from Chiltern Railways, for example. Chiltern Railways recognised that they had a reporting problem. They really weren't getting an awful lot coming through at all, which seemed odd because they knew things were happening on the railway. So they started off by reviewing what wasn't working well, and people gave a lot of examples of what wasn't working well. It was too much paperwork, too bureaucratic. It was felt to be quite tough to report. It wasn't clear what people should be reporting, what constituted a near miss in the context of drivers, engineering staff, etc. But perhaps the biggest blocker that they were experiencing was peer group pressure. There was a feeling that if you reported something, you'd be effectively shopping a friend or a colleague, and that would be seen in a negative way by colleagues. So they started with that big blocker. They did a lot of talking to people, consulting with them, and bit by bit, not quickly, but over a period of time, they felt that they changed the mindset of the majority of people, so that reporting incidents was seen as, I'm actually looking after my colleagues and my team. They clarified what actually was a near miss. They sort of rebranded it as a close call, and they gave lots of examples of close call, which they put on mugs and thermos flasks, etc., that went to staff. And they cut down on the paperwork. They came up with a phone-based system so you can report very relatively easily. And they were careful to give timely feedback to the reporting staff and those involved in the investigation. So they did a lot of the things that we saw, in the kind of green boxes on the previous slide. And overall, they felt they turned reporting into a positive experience. And that certainly came out in the numbers. They had only about one report a month in the previous year, and that shot up to 70 reports per month. So a huge increase in the amount of incidents and events they were having reported. So there's a few case studies like that through the guidance document, which hopefully will be helpful to readers. Won't go through all the chapters, maybe just talk a bit about broader learning, which we mentioned as a topic that hasn't been covered so much in previous guidance. And this graphic is trying to show that an organisation, in order to have effective LFI, needs to broaden out from those immediately affected by the change, so those in the bottom left corner, effectively changing in the short term to prevent reoccurrence. A good LFI system will help embed change amongst the wider workforce for the longer term. Hopefully they will apply those learnings more widely to dissimilar events as well. And then actually apply some of these processes to learning to learn, to improve the LFI stages, and also to share this information with the outside world, with information going in and also being sucked in from other companies. So by way of conclusion, the need for additional guidance on LFI was recognised by the Energy Institute and the Tripod Foundation and the stakeholders. The guidance was developed with a lot of input from these various workshops I've mentioned. And we believe firmly that if we implement the good practices in the guidance, that could lead to significant improvements in LFI. And the research appears to show that the lost learning that is happening at the moment, that the LFI improvements could help plug these gaps and, we believe, reduce risk.
very much. If I could have, because we're going to have a short panel session now where we can ask questions. It could be, tell me what's more, what else is